Welcome to our video where we'll be exploring the insights of renowned psychologist and author, Jordan Peterson, on the flow of money to the top 1% of the population. As you may know, the richest 100 people in the world have as much wealth as the bottom 2.5 billion. In this video, we'll delve deeper into Peterson's understanding of why some individuals and families are able to amass and maintain great wealth, while others struggle financially. Get ready to uncover the untold truth about the financial success and failure, as we explore Peterson's perspectives on the topic.
1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% has almost all of that, right? So I think it's like the richest 100 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. And you think, well, that's a terrible thing, and perhaps it is, but what you have to understand is that that law governs the distribution of creative production across all creative domains, right? It's something like a natural law, and we'll talk about that more, but imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. You've all played Monopoly. What happens when you play Monopoly? One person ends up with all the money, all right? Then you play another game of Monopoly. What happens? One person ends up with all the money. It's actually the inevitable consequence of multiple trades that are conducted randomly. So if you take 1,000 people and you get them to play a trading game, you each give them $100, say, or $10, and they have to trade with another person by flipping a coin. I win the coin toss, you give me $1, you win, I give you $1. If we all play that long enough, one person will end up with all the money and everyone else will end up with zero. So it's a deeply built feature of systems of creative production, and no one really knows what to do about it, because of course the danger is that all the resources get funneled to a tiny minority of people at the top, and a huge section of the population stacks up at zero. But to blame that on the oppressive nature of a given system is to radically underestimate the complexity of the problem. No one actually knows how to effectively shovel resources from the minority that controls almost everything to the majority that has almost nothing in any consistent way, because as you shovel money down, it tends to move right back up, and it's a big problem.
Jordan Peterson discusses the unequal distribution of wealth and resources in society. They argue that a small percentage of the population holds a significant amount of wealth, and an even smaller fraction of that percentage holds the majority of that wealth. Jordan Peterson suggests that this distribution pattern is not limited to economics but also extends to other domains of creative production. He uses the analogy of playing Monopoly to illustrate their point. In multiple rounds of the game, one person eventually ends up with all the money, demonstrating the inevitable concentration of resources through random trades. Jordan implies that this concentration of wealth is a natural consequence of human interaction, rather than solely a result of an oppressive system. Jordan Peterson argues that simply blaming the system for this unequal distribution overlooks the complexity of the issue. They suggest that redistributing resources from the wealthy minority to the impoverished majority is not a straightforward task, as the money tends to flow back to the top.
The thing you want to understand about that 1% issue that you always hear about is that it applies in every single realm where there's difference in creative production. Every realm. Doesn't matter. Number of records produced, number of records sold, number of compositions written. So here's an example. 5 composers produce the music that occupies 50% of the classical repertoire, right? Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Mozart. That's right, those 5. So that's another example of this Price's law of scaling. It applies to all sorts of things, like number of hockey goals scored is also distributed this way. Size of cities follows the same distribution. So, you know, people talk about all the time about how unfair it is that the 1% of the population has the vast amount of the money, and 1% of the 1% has most of that money, and 1% of the 1% of the 1% has most of that money. But it's an inevitable conclusion of iterated trading games, and we don't know how to fight it. We don't know how to take from the people who have and move it to the bottom without it instantly moving back up to the top. Different people maybe, but still back up to the top. Because even the 1% churns a lot. Like, I think you have a 10% chance, if I remember correctly, you have a 10% chance of being in the top 1% for at least 1 year of your life, and a 40% chance of being in the top 10% for at least 1 year in your life. That's in Canada and the US. It's less so in Europe. So there's a fair bit of churning at the top end. It's not the same people all the time who have the money, but it is a tiny fraction of the people all the time who have all the money. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and the Ukraine. So what happened in the 1920s when bloody Lenin came along and collectivized the farms was that they defined the kulaks, who were these tiny minority of successful farmers who maybe had a brick house and were able to hire a couple of people and had some land and some livestock and were very productive people. They defined them as socially unfriendly elements, and they sent groups of intellectuals out into the towns to collectivize the farms. And so the idea was that, well, you would pool your land and everyone would farm it collectively, and the land was taken away, of course, from the tiny minority of people who were actually productive and had actually managed to own much of the land. So you have to imagine how that would occur.
Jordan Peterson discusses the concept of the Pareto Principle, also known as the 80-20 rule or Price's law, which suggests that a small percentage of individuals or entities in a given field or domain account for a disproportionately large amount of the output or success. He applies this principle to various realms, including creative production, music composers, sports goals, and wealth distribution. Jordan then provides an example from history, referencing the collectivization of farms in the 1920s in Russia and Ukraine under Lenin's rule. They mention that a small minority of successful farmers, known as kulaks, were deemed socially unfriendly elements and had their land confiscated as part of the collectivization process. This action resulted in the loss of productive farmers who had previously been responsible for producing a significant portion of the food in the region.
Okay, so it's in the 1920s, it's after World War I, Russia's in pretty bad shape, the villages are full of brutalized men who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and lots of people who are not doing well at all, and the bloody intellectuals come into the town and they say, you know those successful farmers up the street that you've always been pretty jealous about in your useless manner? Well, they're actually pigs and demons who are stealing from you, so why don't you come out, we'll form a nice little mob and we'll take everything they've got. And that's exactly what happened, and all those people were killed or raped or set off to Siberia in the middle of the bloody winter where there wasn't even anything for them to, anywhere for them to live or anything for them to eat, so they all died. And then the consequence of that was a few years later, 6 million people starved to death in the Ukraine. So the Soviets really implemented and perfected the idea of class and ethnicity-based guilt. It's a very bad road to walk down, and it's something that we're very much engaged in at the moment, because there's discussion everywhere in North America now about the idea of, well, race-predicated guilt, for example, and ethnic-predicated guilt. It's a very bad idea to classify an entire group of people as guilty of anything based on their group membership.
Jordan Peterson describes the situation in Russia in the 1920s after World War I, emphasizing the post-war turmoil, the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, among the population, and the dire living conditions. They go on to explain that intellectuals arrived in towns and vilified the successful farmers, the kulaks, by portraying them as demons and thieves who were exploiting others. This manipulation led to mobs forming and violently seizing the kulaks' property. Jordan highlights the brutal treatment, including killings, rapes, and forced deportations to Siberia, resulting in the deaths of those affected. Subsequently, they mention the devastating consequence of widespread starvation, with millions of people dying in the Ukraine. He then draws a parallel between these historical events and the contemporary discussions in North America concerning the concept of guilt based on race or ethnicity. They argue against the idea of categorizing an entire group of people as guilty solely due to their group membership, emphasizing the negative outcomes and dangers associated with such classification.
You're accustomed to keeping things in the fog in general. You're going to keep yourself in the fog with regards to your investments, because in some sense everything you do is an investment. I mean, some of it's quantified in monetary terms, but you're always investing in one manner or another. And so I think if your character has been disrupted by your persistent attempts to deceive yourself about the nature of reality, you're going to be a financial train wreck. And I mean, I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice. I've seen people burn through amounts of money that you wouldn't think someone could burn through in that short a period of time because of self-deceptive blindness. If you have a high IQ and you're conscientious, which is another trait, then you're more likely to be financially successful, say, by the time you're in middle age. And so that looks like two temperamental traits whose presence enables you to beat randomness over time. So those traits work very well in this society at this time, but you can also argue that that's also a matter of chance, because there wouldn't be unconscientious people if at some point in the past unconscientiousness hadn't aided their survival. So what constitutes beating a system depends on the parameters that you put around the system. And you can think the same thing about, well, look at how successful he is. Okay, you mean financially. All right, so then, well, how's his health? How's his marriage? How are his relationships with his children? What price did he pay for his wealth? Like as you add dimensions of evaluation, whether that particular person won or lost might not be so self-evident.
Jordan Peterson emphasizes the connection between personal character and financial well-being. They suggest that if an individual's character has been influenced by self-deception or a persistent attempt to deceive oneself about reality, it can lead to financial instability or reckless behavior. He refers to their clinical practice and witnessing individuals rapidly depleting significant amounts of money due to their blind spots and self-deceptive tendencies. Peterson further discusses the influence of traits such as high IQ and conscientiousness on financial success, stating that these traits increase the likelihood of achieving financial stability by middle age. They also acknowledge that the presence of these traits can be seen as a result of chance, as different traits may have aided survival in different circumstances in the past.
One idea that's very common in our culture is that poverty is caused by lack of money, and that's a really stupid idea, because money is very difficult to handle. I had clients who were addicts, and the worst possible thing that could happen to them was that they got some money. They're just done. First of all, they were hanging around with people who were a little on the sociopathic side, and so especially if they weren't that bright and couldn't defend themselves very well, as soon as they got money, well, it was off to the bar with all the friends. And one guy I remember in particular, every time he got his disability check, he was gone for 5 days. You usually found him in a ditch, because he'd just go to the bar, spend every cent he had on alcohol, and wake up in a ditch, 3/4 dead, eventually completely. And then he was ashamed and horrified and repentant, and he'd straighten himself out again, and then that was all well and good until, as long as he was broke, until the next check showed up, and then bang, the same thing. So it's not like money is necessarily a good for everyone. It's hard to manage money. It's really easy for it to disappear. I mean, elderly people have a hell of a time now because crooks are contacting them on the internet non-stop, and so just giving people money, it's like pouring water in their hands. It's not that helpful, not necessarily that helpful. And then, of course, contributors to poverty are, well, it's not so good to have a low IQ. People don't like the idea of IQ because it seems so arbitrary. Have a high IQ. Well, it's not like you deserve it exactly. You're set up that way pretty much right from the beginning. It's very, 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 very stable. You can make a high IQ person stupider by, not educating them up to the level of their possibility, but taking someone who has a low IQ and trying to raise that, it's like, if you can figure out how to do that, well, it's Nobel Prize time for you, because people have tried that a lot, and our society is increasingly sophisticated, so it's by no means obvious. The liberals think, well, this society is unfair because there's unemployment, and the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone, but none of them think, well, there are massive, massive, massive differences in people's ability, far greater than anyone realizes, and that poses a structural problem. I had a client, and I got him a volunteer job, which is way harder than you think. You need a police check, for example. Like, it's harder to get a volunteer job than a real job, but I got him in a volunteer job, and he had to fold pieces of paper, letters. He worked at a charity. He had to fold pieces of paper in 3 so that he could put them inside envelopes. And then the letters, which were in a pile, had to be matched with the proper envelopes, which were also in a pile. But some of them were French and some of them were English, so the French ones had to be matched carefully to the French envelopes. And if there was one envelope out of order, well, then he had to figure out whether it was the papers that were out of order or the letters that were out of order. And then some of the letters had photographs attached to them, and you weren't supposed to bend the photographs, but they weren't always in the same place, so that meant you had to figure out how to fold the paper in 3, a bunch of different ways without creasing the photograph. And then The other thing is, and I never realized how difficult it is to put a piece of paper in an envelope till I watched someone who couldn't do it. And he probably had an IQ of about 80. You know, if you met him on the street, you wouldn't think anything different of him. He was a normal looking guy.
In conclusion, Jordan Peterson's insights on the flow of money to the top 1% of the population have provided a deeper understanding of the financial success and failure. We have learned that the way in which individuals and families think about and handle money plays a significant role in their ability to amass and maintain wealth. We hope this video has helped shed light on the untold truth about why some people are financial train wrecks while others get rich and stay rich throughout life. Thank you for watching, and we hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking.